Welcome back to Restore 2022, where today we are starting to look at the book of 1 Kings. Let's start with a quick introduction to the book as a whole. Kings continues the story of Israel's monarchy that began in Samuel, describing the period from the end of David's reign until the Babylonian exile. You may remember that back in Deuteronomy, the people were warned that if they failed to keep the covenant with the Lord, then they would lose their land and be oppressed by their enemies. Kings charts the ultimate fulfillment of these covenant curses, and was likely written to the exiled people of God in Babylon to explain why they were in the mess they were in. In describing the reign of each king, the book isn't primarily interested in their political, social, or economic achievements, but in whether they upheld the covenant faithfully or not. Those that get the most space in the book tend to be those that are either outstanding examples of covenant renewal and faithfulness, like Hezekiah and Josiah, or else those that turn the people's hearts away from God, like Ahab and Manasseh. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the first 2 chapters of 1 Kings, we get an account of the transition between David's reign and that of his son Solomon. It is not a smooth one. David is now an old and weak man, still haunted by the words of Nathan after his sin with Bathsheba. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. His weak parenting and the questionable moral example he sets for his sons continue to have devastating consequences for his family and for the nation as a whole. We saw this back in 2 Samuel when Absalom's rebellion ends in a bloody civil war, and we have a disturbing echo of that here with the oldest surviving son, Adonijah. Just like Absalom, Adonijah gets himself a chariot and men to run ahead of him. Just like Absalom, Adonijah secretly gathers influential supporters. And just like Absalom, Adonijah has himself publicly proclaimed king alongside sacrifices, to lend his succession an air of religious legitimacy. The fact that David knows nothing about what is happening suggests just out of touch he has become. And Nathan and Bathsheba have to act quickly in order to avoid a civil war breaking out again. So why does Adonijah feel the need to usurp the throne? After all, he's the oldest surviving son of David, and so he'd likely be in line for the throne when his father dies, which can't be far away. To answer that, we need to revisit 2 Samuel 12, verse 25, which lets us know that Solomon had God's favour from birth. His given name of Jedediah, meaning loved by the Lord, is an echo of David's own name, meaning beloved or favourite. The fact that Nathan was sent with this name for the baby suggests he was the Lord's choice to succeed David. As David had been appointed over his older brothers, so the Lord passed over David's older sons in order to choose the younger. This was likely widely known at the time, and so Adonijah's attempted coup can be seen as a human attempt to disrupt the divine plan. In Joab and Abiathar, Adonijah has secured important military and religious support for his claim to the throne. Joab has always been loyal to David, although his motivations were often suspect or selfish and his methods brutal, and he'd been instrumental in putting down the last rebellion against David, that of Absalom. So his defection shows just how weak David's position has become. Fortunately, the timely intervention of Bathsheba and Nathan places Solomon on the throne while David is still alive, marking him as his father's chosen successor. For Solomon to ride David's own mule was a public proclamation that his succession was legitimate, as was having him anointed by both priest and prophet. A priest traditionally ordained a king who was the natural choice according to dynastic succession, whilst a prophet's presence was necessary for a king who was outside of that, as in the case of Solomon, because he's the younger son. The presence of both priest and prophet here makes Solomon's claim absolute, and lets the people know he was the Lord's chosen king as well as David's choice. Their rejoicing at Solomon's coronation convinces Adonijah's supporters that the coup has failed, and he shrewdly throws himself on the mercy of the anointed king. Solomon gives him a second chance, but warns him there will not be a third. In chapter 2, we see Solomon's throne firmly established. Before he dies, David charges the new king to keep the covenant and asks him to wrap up his unfinished business with Joab and Shimei, whose evil deeds he had been unable to punish himself. Unlike his father, Solomon will not be reliant on Joab's military prowess or bound by an oath to Shimei, so he is free to exact long-denied justice upon them for their actions. we see that Adonijah has not given up his desire for the throne. His request to marry Abishag is far from innocent, because although she was a virgin and had never slept with David, she would have been seen as part of his royal harem. In marrying her, Adonijah's claim to the throne would have been greatly strengthened. Solomon, displaying the wisdom for which he will become famous, is not fooled and has Adonijah executed. He assumes that Abiathar and Joab are still involved in his brother's plotting, and he uses the opportunity to rid himself of them as well, the former through banishment and the latter through execution. Shimei is confined to Jerusalem on pain of death, but later executed when he leaves. As chapter 2 draws to a close, the golden age of Israel begins, united, prosperous, and peaceful. Unfortunately, it is not to last. Within a few short chapters, the slide into idolatry and the split between Judah in the south and Israel in the north will begin.